Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where we explore the past to better understand the profession of arms today. We dive into the campaigns, conflicts, issues, and commanders that have shaped military thinking across centuries, and why it all still matters. Whether you're an officer in training, a seasoned professional, a student of strategy, or simply curious about how history informs modern warfare, this space is for you. Our mission is simple: to foster insight, reflection, and critical thinking primarily through the lens of military history. Before we begin, a quick note. The views expressed in this podcast are of the podcast writers, hosts, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency or organization. So, whether you're listening in a barracks, a lecture hall, at the gym, or in your car on the way to work, welcome. We're glad you're here. Welcome back to Mill History Talk. I'm Hope, and today you're listening to episode 54. This is one of those episodes where history stops being comfortable and starts being honest. Because in the years after Vietnam, senior Army leaders used a word they almost never use. Not challenged, not strained, but broken.
And they didn't mean broken in a metaphorical sense. They meant discipline had collapsed, morale had cratered, trust between soldiers and officers had frayed, and in some cases, snapped entirely. This wasn't about losing a war. It was about losing institutional cohesion.
So today we're going to spend most of this episode, about 2/3, walking through how that breakdown happened. And then we'll turn to the harder, quieter story, how the Army rebuilt itself, painfully, deliberately, and emerged as the highly professional force we saw in Desert Storm. Vietnam didn't end with a parade. It ended with exhaustion, resentment, and a draft force that no longer trusted the institution it served. Soldiers came home to protests, officers came home to skepticism, and the Army came home to itself, fractured.
The problem wasn't just morale, it was legitimacy. Many soldiers no longer believed the mission in Vietnam had meaning. The president himself said we were turning the war over the South Vietnamese to fight. And when legitimacy disappears, discipline follows it out the door.
Before the Army could fix discipline, leadership, or doctrine, it had to confront a deeper truth. Many of the problems tearing the force apart weren't created inside the Army. They came from outside it.
By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War itself had become deeply unpopular with the American public. Not just controversial, but openly rejected. And because the Army was built on a conscription system, that unpopularity flowed directly into the ranks.
The draft wasn't just unpopular, it was widely perceived as unfair. College deferments, occupational exemptions, medical loopholes. Large segments of American society believed, often correctly, that who served and who didn't depended less on obligation and more on privilege.
That perception mattered, because soldiers who believe the system that put them in uniform is illegitimate are far less likely to accept sacrifice, discipline, or authority once they're there. The Army didn't just inherit reluctant soldiers, it inherited resentment.
This crisis of legitimacy reached the White House. President Richard Nixon concluded that the draft itself had become unsustainable, politically, socially, and institutionally. Not because the Army didn't need manpower, but because conscription was actively undermining morale and cohesion.
The decision to abandon the draft and move to an all-volunteer force was strategic, not sentimental. It acknowledged a hard reality. A modern professional army could not be built on unwilling service in an unpopular war.
But ending the draft created a new challenge. Volunteers had to be recruited, not compelled. That required a fundamental rethinking of how the Army treated its people.
Pay increased significantly. Recruiting commands expanded dramatically. National advertising campaigns followed. Family support programs were strengthened. On-post housing improved. Barracks, dining facilities, and everyday living conditions were upgraded. These weren't perks, they were necessities.
Because when service becomes voluntary, the institution has to earn commitment. Morale stops being assumed, it has to be built. And that shift, from obligation to professionalism, set the conditions for every reform that followed. This is where the story gets dark. By the early 1970s, incidents of insubordination, assault, and drug abuse spiked dramatically. And then there was fragging.
Between Vietnam and the early post-war years, hundreds of grenade or explosive attacks were reported against officers and NCOs. Some were fatal. Many were warnings. And even when incidents were exaggerated, the fear was real. Officers began avoiding enforcement. Command authority eroded from the inside.
Add to that widespread drug use, heroin, marijuana, amphetamines, often tolerated because commanders were afraid to enforce standards.
Racial tensions further strained cohesion. The Army reflected American society, but without the social mechanisms to process conflict safely. Barracks violence, segregated social spaces, and command paralysis all fed the sense that the Army was losing control of itself.
One of the most underappreciated issues was leadership turnover. Commanders rotated too quickly to establish authority or accountability.
In Vietnam, 6-month commands were common. That culture followed the Army home. You can't fix a unit you don't own, and you can't own a unit you're about to leave.
Here's the turning point. Senior leaders stopped pretending this was normal post-war turbulence. General Edward "Shy" Meyer said it out loud. The Army is broken.
That admission mattered.
The recovery didn't start with doctrine. It started with consequences. That mattered because one of the Army's deepest post-Vietnam failures wasn't bad intentions, it was permissiveness. Rules existed, but enforcement had become inconsistent, hesitant, and uneven.
The post-Vietnam leadership understood something fundamental. Discipline cannot be selective. Article 15's returned, used consistently, not symbolically. Minor infractions were addressed immediately. Major violations carried real penalties. The goal wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was restoring predictability.
Predictability is professionalism. When soldiers know exactly where the line is and that it applies to everyone, you start rebuilding trust in the institution itself.
At the same time, the Army aggressively reduced its force. Expedited discharges removed chronic drug users, habitual offenders, and soldiers who had no intention of meeting professional standards. This wasn't cruelty, it was institutional survival. A smaller army that could be led was preferable to a larger army that could not be controlled.
And just as important, leadership tours were lengthened. Commanders stayed long enough to own the culture they created. They were no longer passing problems forward. That shift alone restored credibility at the company and battalion level, where discipline actually lives.
Professional armies require boundaries. Without them, authority collapses. With them, trust begins to return.
Once discipline and leadership stability began to return, the Army turned to the next problem. How do we fight and train like a modern professional force again?
This is where doctrine and training became inseparable. Under the newly created TRADOC, the Army centralized how it thought about war. Training was standardized. Evaluation became ruthless. Doctrine stopped being aspirational and started being executable.
Active defense came first, very deliberately. It reflected a sober assessment of reality. Numerically inferior NATO forces facing massed Warsaw Pact armor. It wasn't elegant, it was practical. It was numbers-based, and it demonstrated that the size, organization, and most importantly, the technology were not up to the requirements of its NATO mission, defending the Fulda Gap in West Germany.
But the Army didn't stop there. Active defense had problems. Exercises revealed that the active defense doctrine, even with new technologies, would not have been able to stop a Soviet attack into Germany. So the doctrine was reworked again, and the airland battle doctrine was the result. The new doctrine built around initiative, depth, synchronization, and tempo, extending the battlefield deep beyond the limits of the close battle and thus providing time and space for the new technologies to achieve decisive effects against the attacking Soviets. This was not just about winning battles. It was about restoring confidence in leadership, systems, and training.
And doctrine finally met reality at the National Training Center. Force on force training. No scripts, no protecting reputations. Units lost, often badly. And that was the point.
Failure was institutionalized as a learning tool. Leaders were evaluated honestly. Units were forced to confront weaknesses in command, logistics, and coordination. That experience rewired the Army's culture.
And then came modernization, the Big Five, the Abrams, Bradley, Apache, Blackhawk, Patriot, designed specifically for the new doctrine. These weren't prestige platforms, they were answers to Vietnam-era failures: night fighting, survivability, mobility, integration, and command control. Vietnam caused the U.S. Army to fall a generation behind Soviet Army technology. The Big Five caught the Army up and passed the Soviets.
Just as importantly, they sent a message to soldiers. The institution was investing in them and expected professional performance in return.
Training, doctrine, and equipment finally aligned. That alignment rebuilt competence, and competence rebuilt confidence.
Outside the Army, things were happening as well. In 1987, Congress passed the Goldwater-Nicholas Act, which mandated joint operations. It established the supremacy of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, required joint military education for senior officers, and established permanent joint regional headquarters, such as CENTCOM and EUCOM and PACOM. In a word, it institutionalized jointness and greatly reduced ad hoc strategic thinking.
By 1991, the transformation was visible. Disciplined units, stable leadership, integrated doctrine.
The Army that executed Desert Storm didn't appear overnight. It was rebuilt, slowly, from the wreckage of Vietnam.
So, what's the takeaway? Institutions don't collapse all at once. They erode when legitimacy fades and standards go unenforced.
And recovery isn't glamorous. It requires leadership, accountability, professionalism, and time.
The post-Vietnam Army learned that readiness is cultural. You don't buy it, you build it.
And you maintain it, or you lose it again.
That's episode 54 of Mill History Talk. If you want deeper reading, check the show notes. We've linked our Substack with articles on Vietnam, reform, and Cold War doctrine.
Because history doesn't repeat, but institutions that stop learning do.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.